So, I'm trying to select basic philosophical and historical points. Kind of ran over from downtown. Basic points that are you can actually remember after the class is over. I mean, rather just kind of stuff your short-term memory with all kinds of data that you'll obviously forget within minutes or hours after the semester's over. Trying to focus on the large issues, things that perhaps could actually benefit you in the sense of adding to your general understanding of religion and human life. So when we talk about Buddhism, there are like literally millions of details to Buddhism in terms of names and dates and all kinds of things that you can read, but what strikes me is very important, and then when we get on to the Mimamsa people, what strikes me as very important and universal is that after the historical Buddha, who kind of, as I say, played his cards close to his chest, he didn't reveal that much. He discouraged doctrine, just sort of said you're suffering, this is how you can stop suffering, and so on. But after the historical Buddha, Buddhism, as it grew and spread, at least perhaps the main wing of it, began to emphasize that there's no self and began to attribute this idea that there's no eternal person, no eternal soul. They attributed this to Buddha, although not everybody agreed with them. Within Buddhism, many people disagreed with that. And eventually, this idea that you don't exist as a person, it's not really like people are going to beat a path to your door to buy that, because it's a nice intellectual idea, but ultimately, in the real world, people do become attached to their friends, to their relatives, their family. People fall in love. They want to know, like, what's going to happen to me and what happened to my parents and my wife or husband and my children. And the idea that somehow life goes on, that somehow I'm real, my existence as an individual is somehow real, that won. That was the winner. And the idea that we don't exist as individuals, it's all an illusion, we just sort of dissolve into this type of impersonal consciousness. You have no individual freedom, you make no individual choices, you do not fall in love, you never dance, you never listen to music, you just basically kind of, well, you don't exist. That was not a big hit, ultimately, historically. And we can see again and again and again that attempts to deny the reality of individual, free, personal existence, these attempts in the real world fail. They have their day as intellectual ideas, and some people feel drawn to it and actually somehow attracted to the idea of philosophical suicide, you might say. Philosophically and meditationally obliterating your individual existence. But ultimately, the overwhelming majority of people did not go for this. They actually liked being persons, and they thought, well, maybe I can just go on being a person in the future. And so that's what happened. Now, to give you an example, before we go on to the Mimamsa people, I wanted to give one example which I didn't fit in last Wednesday, somehow or other. An example of how after the Buddha, who said very little, really, in a sense, and metaphysically, there were many people that claimed to be speaking what Buddha really meant or really said, although you can't really historically trace it, but this is really what he was trying to say. So an example of this is found in a book on sort of a mainstream book on the history of Indian philosophy. And we find this quote in which they sort of uncritically, without any historical, critical perspective, attribute this to the Buddha because some people centuries later said that Buddha said it. And so I just want to read that to you because it's very revealing, I think. So the Buddha apparently said, according to some people that came afterwards, that people who suffer from the illusion of the self, in other words, if you think that you exist, you're an illusion. And you're not just an illusion because of the way you think you exist, like maybe I'm too vain, or I'm too proud, or I don't really see the oneness of everyone. Just a fundamental idea that you exist as a free individual person, that's an illusion, according to these people, who, as I say, did not win the day. So, people who suffer from the illusion of self do not know its nature clearly. Still, they strongly protest that they love the soul. This, Buddha remarks, again, this is not a strictly speaking historical Buddha, but some later interpretations. This, Buddha remarks, is like falling in love with the most beautiful maiden. This is more of a guy example. Falling in love with the most beautiful maiden, though she's never been seen or known. In other words, you've never seen this girl, guys. You've never seen this girl, and you've never met her, but you fall in love with her. Do people really do that? Do people really do that? I mean, now, you may not have met someone, but you have an image in your mind, maybe like, some kind of internet romance or something, and you sort of, and she's never actually revealed her physical form through a picture yet. However, you kind of form an impression in your mind. And I mean, you read books. Let's say you read a novel, and the novel sort of goes with that technique where you don't give too many details. You let the reader be an interactive participant, so you're kind of co-creating the story. So you hear about, for example, the beautiful young lady who sat weeping in the lonely house on top of the hill. And so everyone kind of has their image of like, who is that girl weeping in the lonely house on the top of the hill. And so you do form an image in your mind. But this example is that you fall in love with someone for whom you have no image at all, nothing. Does that really happen? I don't think so. Anyway, you fall in love with a maiden who's never been seen or known. That's from a book called the Pottapada Sutta. Or is it, it's like building a staircase to a palace you've never seen. Of course, in America, we call that the bridge to nowhere, if you follow politics. But anyway, so you build a staircase to a palace you've never seen. Do people really do that when they're not corrupt politicians, just, earmarking money? People don't really do that. But anyway, that's the example. Now, I wanted to contrast that with another statement attributed to the Buddha, interestingly, because nirvana, we're told that we should not go with the soul. Don't believe in yourself. Don't think you really exist. Don't love your soul or don't love other souls because you really have absolutely no experience of yourself as an individual person. Really? I don't think so. I think actually a lot of us do have something like an experience of ourselves as a person. And sometimes we even have deep moments when we kind of experience ourselves as something more than just whatever we can kind of, do to ourselves to present to the public. Like, do you think I'm attractive enough yet? So, we do have experiences of ourselves as some kind of... And Buddha himself apparently said that nirvana is like the wind. We can't see it, but we know it's there. So you see these kind of contradictory statements. Nirvana... And to this day, if you read books on Buddhism, they're still not exactly sure what nirvana is. And so the idea that you exist, but you don't exist, it's not you, and there's a nirvana, but we can't talk about it because words fail, and it's like the wind, so you know it's there, but you can't really see it. And this is kind of like the very practical, real-world thing we should devote our life to, not something that no one's ever experienced, like the fact that you exist. Well, anyway, I thought that was a little counterintuitive, so I wanted to point that out. And ultimately, Mahayana Buddhism, which is now 85% or more of living Buddhists, they very much are invested in ideas like going to heaven, going to paradise, getting a good rebirth, saving your ancestors, and all kinds of things which assume the existence of a person, a real person, even if at some very lofty intellectual level, some Buddhist philosophers deny it, but in the real world Buddhism, even Buddhist monks are very concerned about where I'm going and where mom and dad went and grandma and grandpa and the kids and everybody. So this is a very deep concern. So anyway, now, Mimamsa. Around the time that, let's say about 2,000 years ago approximately, these dates are uncertain, and you find all kinds of dates in our book, but until about 2,000 years ago, the dates are extremely speculative, and they even sometimes are truly wild, if not reckless guesses. But anyway, about 2,000 years ago or so, or perhaps older, there was a thing that became popular called Mimamsa. Well, the rest of this blackboard is pristine, so Mimamsa comes from a Sanskrit root, man, which means to think. It's cognitive with the English word mind or mental. And Mimamsa basically in Sanskrit means thinking real hard. So the Mimamsa people were the ones who, let's say, most directly opposed some of the claims of the Buddhists and Jains. Because the Mimamsa people were those who performed the rituals. Now, the Vedas, which we talked about earlier, the original 4 Vedas, the Rig Veda is all the hymns that you chant at rituals. The Yajur Veda tells you how to perform the rituals and what they mean. The Sama Veda is sort of like the melodies, the chants, how to chant the mantras. Those are the 3 main Vedas. So it's all about these rituals. And the Mimamsa people were basically Brahmins who lived by performing rituals. They were the technocrats of the great Vedic rituals. And so when the Jains and Buddhists came along and said, stop doing rituals, these rituals are useless, there's no meaning to them, this was a direct challenge. It could not be a more direct challenge to the Mimamsa people. And so they fought against Buddhism. Among the people that fought against Buddhism and Jainism, these ideas that forget the rituals and all that, and forget the caste system, because they were also caste Brahmins. And that's how they made their living. And I don't mean to say it was only about money, but that is how they made their living. And they were, we talk so much about this caste system that tends to be oppressive, or the Brahmins sometimes are oppressive. These are the Brahmins. These are the guys. These are the guys that sit on top of the heap of the Vedic caste system. These are the guys that do the rituals. You have to, your, let's say, voyage to heaven, some kind of heaven, is mediated by these people. And they developed a whole philosophy. They didn't just stick their tongues out at the Jains and the Buddhists. They actually had a whole philosophy. They were intellectually sophisticated, if somewhat odd. And so I want to talk a little bit about what their argument was, how they defended their position on top of the caste system, and how they defended, because they did defend it, their position as the performance of ritual. And probably in human history, I think most scholars would agree, in all of human history, never was the performance of ritual, just ritual, analyzed and defended to this degree of sophistication. This is something really almost unique in human history, this degree of intellectual sophistication in terms of analyzing and defending the performance of ritual. Yes?
Can I ask you sort of like a nitpicky question? Just like, where was sort of the geographical center of this?
Mimamsa. Well, this is sort of pan-Indian.
Pan-Indian?
Yeah, this is very mainstream.
Okay.
And basically what they do is they take, let's say, a ritual. Like you light a fire. There's a sacrificial ground. And let's say in a state ritual, there are basically 2 kinds of fire sacrifice. It's all about fire sacrifice. And so there are sort of solemn rituals, state rituals, patronized by kings and princes. And these are called shota. These are just words. And then there are the home sacrifices. Like every Brahmin in his home keeps a fire going, the Agnihotra, and every day makes a ritual offering into the fire. The basic idea here is that the fire is a god, Agni. And that fire mediates. And by the way, you find this all over the planet back then. This is the central religious act of Persia, of Greece, of, just the world. This fire sacrifice back thousands of years ago. And the basic idea is the fire mediates our relationship between earth and heaven. We are down here on earth. We're trying to get to heaven. This heaven and earth are mediated by fire, because fire is a god that appears on earth. So when you take some earthly substance like clarified butter or milk or grains, or of course some people killed animals and offered that. So whatever you offer into the fire, you're taking some earthly object, and somehow mystically that object, as it is burned, as it is consumed in some celestial form, is being transmitted to higher worlds. The gods, the goddesses are accepting that offering and actually being nourished by it, because it's like, let's say, for example, people in charge of governments. Take a king. A king has all this power. A king rules the kingdom. And yet if no one pays their taxes, the king can't even get a good lunch. If no one pays their taxes, everything collapses. So even though apparently the peasants are way down there and the king is way up there, if the peasants don't farm, if they don't do their duties, if no one pays taxes, the king also falls. And so there was this idea, there was this radical reinterpretation of the universe, actually, so that even the gods depend on offerings done by Brahmins. Basically, in this philosophy, Brahmins sustain the universe. There is a natural order. You've heard about the Buddhist and Jain Dharma, like the path, what you're supposed to do. according to this idea, a dharma, what dharma means to these people in Mimamsa is something like the Stoic view of logos. Around the time of Jesus, the word logos, of course we have words like logic and so on, was a very key term. And the basic idea, which was extremely popular among intellectuals in Europe, let's say just basically around the Roman Empire, even the Near East and so on. And the basic idea was that within the mind of God, there is a logic, you could say. God is reasonable. And God creates the world according to logic and reason, so that you can study biology, physiology. I mean, the very fact that every field has ology at the end, that's from logos. The logos of physics, the logos of bios, Greek word for life. The logos of life is biology. The logos of the physical world is, it's physics. Of the body didn't work there. Physiology and so on. So the idea is that the logos exists in the mind of God. The universe is created according to this pattern. And then human beings are also endowed with the same logos, so that you can connect by studying nature. You can actually connect to this logos, which is in you and in nature, and therefore you can connect to God through this logos. Now, in a sense, there's a sense in which the Sanskrit word dharma is like that. The idea is that there are laws governing the universe. Human beings can perceive this dharma and connect to this divine pattern, this divine logic within the universe. In fact, the caste system is a logos. It's a divine logic. It's a divine pattern that we connect to, that we recognize. And by the way, it's because of this, the popularity of this logos, that according to basically all historians, a man in West Turkey, a few generations after Jesus, wrote a book trying to appeal to intellectuals of his day, and he began the book by saying, in the beginning was the logos, or the word, that's the book of John, and the logos became incarnate. So because everybody was into this logos, he said, well, guess what, everybody? The logos now actually incarnated in this world as Jesus. And so it was a powerful argument at the time. So in India, they had the concept of dharma. And the caste system was this divine logic, this divine pattern, and so on and so forth. Now, the Mimamsas, though, particularly, they took a very odd turn. And that is, they are basically atheistic. There's no creator God here. So the Dharma, which does not exist in the mind of God, as it did for Stoics, say, in the farther west, it exists in the Veda. The Veda eternally exists, and the Veda is called a Paurusheya. You don't have to memorize all this stuff, but if you're interested, the word Purusha means person, and it can mean person with a capital P, meaning God, the Supreme Person, and means not. Paurusheya means not coming from any person. So the Veda is not spoken by God. This is not God speaking the Veda. The Veda just exists eternally. And in between creation cycles, when the universe is destroyed and recreated, the Veda just pops up again. It's just always there. This didn't convince most people, but that was their view. And so this is Mimamsa in a nutshell. And for example, when you do a sacrifice, like no detail was too technical to escape their notice. For example, when you do a sacrifice, how many fire sticks do you use? And how much ghee do you offer? If the Veda says offer ghee, how much? Is it 1 cup? Is it 2 cups? And if the Veda says you should honor different gods, what order do you honor them in? Which mantra for each god? And so on. So to this day in India, when people perform these elaborate rituals and sacrifices, they defer to the Mimamsa people. So the Mimamsa people established the permanent standards because of their unbelievably painstaking, stop-at-nothing, sophisticated analysis of ritual. Now the gods in the Mimamsa system, because again this is all about worshiping and praying to gods, are simply paraphernalia. In other words, this is the way to put it, as I've explained before. Let's say you want to get a new driver's license. You go down to the DMV, and let's say you pass the test and you show proof of identity and you pay the money. They have to give you a driver's license. There are certain objective rules to get a driver's license or a passport or whatever. And if you fulfill all those requirements, the bureaucrat behind the counter at the DMV has no discretionary power to say, I don't like you, or you didn't smile at me, or, I don't know you that well. I'm not going to give you a driver's license, or you don't get a passport. They have to give it to you. Let's say you go into a store to buy a banana. And let's say you're behaving yourself, you're not like causing a disturbance, and you go in there and you go to the checkout stand and you put your money down, or your credit card or whatever, and the person says, I won't sell you this banana. Why? I just, I don't like you or something. In other words, we live in a world in which we expect that there should be objective requirements, and if we fulfill them, then we should get certain benefits. And this is exactly how the Mimamsa people saw sacrifice. It's not a question of pleasing a God. It's not a question of getting the mercy of a God. When you go down to the DMV, it's not to get the mercy of the bureaucrat behind the counter. Unless you're in many third world countries, it is to get the mercy of the person behind the counter. I remember, anyway, I have many stories because I spent a lot of time in different countries, but at least we expect that to be the standard. So for the Mimamsas, the gods and goddesses are simply cosmic bureaucrats. That's all. They're bureaucrats. They have no discretionary power. You pay your light bill, the lights stay on. That's all. Right? If you just you can have an automatic debiting system or something where it comes out of your bank account. I've been paying light bills and water bills, I guess, for many decades. I've never really met a living person on the other end. I just paid the bill. So in that way, that's how they saw the gods and goddesses. They're just cosmic bureaucrats, and therefore, in their elaborate way of classifying the different elements of sacrifice, the gods and goddesses are in the same category as something like a milk cup, like a little cup to hold milk. They're just like paraphernalia. Spoons, cups, fire sticks, gods, goddesses, it's all the same. Yes?
I'm a little confused. So these sacrifices are to sustain
the universe,
but who receives the sacrifice?
Very good question. Even if the gods are, it's like when you get your driver's license, who takes your check? But that person's just a bureaucrat. And so the universe is constructed in such a way that these sacrifices somehow, coordinates with just the basic mechanism of the universe. The universe is a mechanism, and the sacrifice somehow is in sync with that mechanism and will get you to heaven. Yes?
How did they come about with all these elaborate and subjective rules? How did they discover these? That's so objective.
Maybe just some ancient Brahmins with too much time on their hands. Anyway, now another point, in terms of their philosophy of language. Their view was that in reading the Vedas, because there are other parts of the Vedas that say rituals aren't that important. It's more important to know the self, to understand God. And so they had a whole interpretation of language, which was that the paradigmatic, the fundamental, central kind of speech or language is the injunction, which in Sanskrit, is called vidya, the injunction. So, therefore, as an example of a statement, a Vedic statement, the Mimamsas would say, this is an absolutely central Vedic statement. And all other kinds of Vedic statements are subordinate to this kind of statement. I'll just give you an example. It's, Swarga in Sanskrit means heaven. And this is a material heaven. This is not an eternal spiritual world where you live with God. This is just a material heaven where you get all kinds of, whatever you want. So, Swarga Kamo. Kama means desire. You may have heard of the Kama Sutra. We won't be studying that this semester, but anyways, Kama simply means desire. So Swarga Kamo, which means one who desires heaven. One who desires heaven. And now here's the key word, yajeta. Yajeta in Sanskrit means should sacrifice or must sacrifice. Anyway, this is the root yaj, to sacrifice. So, and this grammatical form, this form of the verb, is called the vidhi form of the verb. The vidhi ling, it's the injunctive form of the verb. You must do this. It's not the direct imperative, but it's the injunctive. So, so for the Mimamsas, this is what the Vedas are about. And this gets so wild that, for example, as we'll read the Upanishads, if you find a statement in the Upanishads that says very clearly, life is meant to understand the self, they'll say yes, by all means, but you have to understand yourself as a sacrificer. In other words, you have to understand yourself as someone who hires a Brahmin to do a sacrifice. So, anyway, it's an amazing world we live in. So, these are the Mimamsa people. And that's their theory of language and their theory of the Vedas, and they fought very hard against the Buddhists. And you can see how this is absolutely diametrically opposed to some of the revolutionary ideas of the Jains and Buddhists. Yes?
Does the concept of Brahman still exist with these Brahmins?
Does it what?
The concept of Brahman, the universal spirit, still exists within this tradition or
A
not?
Brahman. Not so much. There's no creator God. They want to go to heaven. They really are not very concerned. And they take all this language about Brahman, the absolute truth, the soul, the eternal soul. It's just kind of whatever. It's just sort of almost frivolous language in the Vedas. But the real language is the stuff that tells you to offer sacrifices. This did not become overwhelmingly popular. Again, we see different traditions that are not entirely natural. And so the technical rules survived. Everyone deferred because no one studied ritual as much as they did. So everyone thought, okay, I guess you figured out how to do the ritual. But in terms of a worldview, this was not a big winner. But it was very important at one point, fighting against the Buddhists. That they were, some very powerful intellectuals that were writing books and arguing against Buddhism and Jainism. Yes?
I mean, it seems to me like it developed out of some need to, like, justify keeping a Brahmin class. Is that, like...
Well, there were other ways to justify it. I mean, certainly that was part of it. That was certainly part of it. I think it was I would be more specific and say those Brahmins who were really focused on ritual. Because there was a whole other group of Brahmins who were focused on philosophy and teaching and devotion to God. So there was this diversity. So certainly among the Brahmins who were ritual technocrats and who thought ritual is everything. So it's interesting because another point I wanted to make is that just occurred to me today that the gods really rule the universe. And so in that sense, they're the... My God, are we being tested?
I think it's the maintenance people.
Maintenance people? Okay. So it's the gods are the heavenly equivalent of earthly kings. If you read the descriptions of the gods and goddesses, they really are like this celestial aristocracy. And so just as there was a tension between the warrior class and the Brahmin class, we've seen that even that Buddhism and Jainism arose among the warrior class, the ruling class, who felt kind of, there wasn't enough cultural oxygen left because of the way the Brahmins were behaving. And so, in a sense, the Brahmins, having kind of gotten the upper hand on the kings, at least within the Vedic side, and even actually the Buddhists, anyway, next they had to subordinate the heavenly rulers. In other words, all rulers, whether they're on earth or heaven, are subordinate to Brahmins. And it's actually the Brahmin who sustains the universe by performing sacrifice. So they saw themselves at the center of the universe.
Seems kind of selfish.
If nothing else, it's amazing. So, anyway, Hridayananda says, I think I've given you the... and therefore you find, one last point, we're going to be reading later literature called Itihasa Purana, histories and ancient stories, which really is at the heart of Hinduism. In what became historical Hinduism, that genre of literature full of stories is really the center of Hinduism. And those stories, which are always written by Brahmins, the plot is always moved along by curses and boons, and the way you get power, the power to curse is you perform austerities like a Brahmin. And so these brahminical activities, like say going to the forest, performing severe austerities, self-denial and so on, is the way people get power. So it's a very Brahmin-centric view of the universe. Even in the literature which tells all kinds of stories the plot relies more than in ancient literature of other parts of the world, like Southern and Northern Europe or just wherever. The plot tends to move or to rely much more on let's say, someone cursed someone else. Where did they get the power to curse? By performing austerities, asceticism. Or someone got a boon. How did they get the boon from Lord Shiva, for example? Well, they performed all kinds of austerities under the guidance of Brahman. So even like battle stories like the Mahabharata, great military and political events, adventures of kings and all kinds of things, but still, the mechanism is always moving the plot along and explaining why this or that happened. It always goes back to something under the control of the Brahmins. So, now, practically the main Mimamsa guy who wrote the Mimamsa Sutra, there's a type of literature called sutra literature. Sutra in Sanskrit means a thread, like Vedanta Sutra, Mimamsa Sutra. It literally means a thread. And so it's a kind of literature where you just give the essence. It's very pithy, like these very short statements that give the essence of everything. And anyway, so Jaimini, we'll actually talk about it more when we talk about Vedanta. What I wanted to talk about the remaining time is something I find very interesting. And that is a debate that was going on in India, and which you find it even gets into literature like the Mahabharata that we'll talk about a lot. And that is, it's a debate between, on the one hand, Purusha Kara, which in this case means human action. Purusha, again, means person. Kara, cognate, with the English word create, the K sound here. Purusha Kara, human action, versus Daiva, which you could translate as destiny or fate, but destiny or fate under the control of gods or some kind of divine power. We have the word divine in English. There's a very similar word in Sanskrit. The words are cognate from the same language family. The Sanskrit word would be divya. And from this div, you get the word deva, which means God. And, the Greek form of this is just this, Zeus. And deva, in Spanish, Dios. So anyway, so you have this word deva, which means God. And from the word deva, you get the word daiva, which literally means from God, or from the gods, or goddesses. So anyway, Purushakara versus Daiva means, like a typical example in the Mahabharata, is that a king like Duryodhana will try to do something. He's the bad guy. And he's trying to seize power, but somehow or other his plan fails. And he'll say, what is the use of Purushakara? In other words, what's the use of human action? Why should I even try? Because everything is Daiva. Everything is under the control of destiny. I mean, you've heard the expression Deus. Well, actually, also Deus in Latin, Deva. You've heard Deus ex machina, right? You all know that? They used to study that in college, but anyway. Anyway, in Greek plays, in Greek theater, they had this thing they would do, where if the plot got into this sort of, it got to a point where there's no way out. There's just no way out for the hero. They would literally lower this box with chains. They would lower it onto the stage of the theater, and a god would get out of the box and just, do what had to be done. And, wipe out the bad guys, or just do what had to be done to get the plot going. So that's called, it's a theatrical term, Deus, which is God, ex from, Deus ex machina, God from the machine. And the God would just pop out of the box. And they would actually do this in ancient Greek plays. They would actually lower a box onto the stage. So the idea here is, in terms of salvation, nirvana, moksha, liberation, just getting to where you want to go beyond earth, to what extent is it your own endeavor? And to what extent is it the power of some divine power that you have to somehow placate or appease? Now, Mimamsa is interesting because Mimamsa is at one extreme. Mimamsa is at one extreme in saying that the gods have no discretionary power, which is a real perversion, frankly, if I can use that strong word, of the Vedas. Because if you read the Vedas, say the Rig Veda, there are very heartfelt, urgent prayers of the gods, trying very hard to please a god or goddess, expressing sincere admiration. The Vedas tend to be very beautiful. They're actually exquisite poetry, a lot of it. And it's very powerful, exquisite poetry. And if you read it in Sanskrit or even English, you can't help but feel the power of it. The emotion of it, the feeling. And so to say that this was just sort of like walking up to the counter and paying a bureaucrat, I think the Mimamsa view was really way off the mark. And the later bhakti movements, devotional movements to Krishna, to Shiva, to the goddess, which swept over India, and even swept Buddhism actually, show that this was really kind of what was at the heart of this civilization. It wasn't just this, these guys are just bureaucrats. Anyway, so that's one extreme. Mimamsas are one extreme where they say it's all Purusha, it's all our endeavor. Like the Vedas are a mechanism, the universe is basically a mechanism. Once you figure out the mechanism, you can make it work for you. So it's all, you have the power to do it all yourself, especially if you're a Brahmin. Now there's another extreme. I want to set up these two extremes, both of which I think are somewhat, well, to be honest, irrational. The other extreme, I think the absolute opposite of that would be, the type of predeterminism. And you find this actually, let's say in Christian history. Let me read something about, let me read you a few things about very early Christian history and some of the philosophical debates they had on these issues, these very issues. To what extent does your salvation depend on your own efforts? To what extent does it depend on the intercession of God? And do you have any power at all? Can you in any way affect your destiny? So the theory of predestination caused an early 5th century controversy between Augustine of Hippo, who claimed absolute determination on the part of God. In other words, there's nothing you can do to enhance your chance of salvation. There's nothing you can do. You have nothing to do with it. It's all God. It's absolutely the opposite of, say, the Mimamsa people, who say the gods have nothing to do with it. And Pelagius, there was a heresy. The heresy is basically people that lost. If they won, they would be the true doctrine. But since they lost, they're heresies. So Pelagius upheld the doctrine of free will. Free will, that we have free will. We can actually choose God, or we can choose to do the right thing, and so on. Martin Luther and John Calvin adopted the Augustinian view. Martin Luther and John Calvin at the Reformation. But Jacobus Arminius adopted the Pelagian standpoint. So here's another point. Early church fathers consistently upheld the freedom of human choice. The freedom of human choice. This position was crucial in the Christian confrontation with cynicism. Because there were other philosophical groups, like people who were cynical, said, we have no power, there's no free will. Or some of the chief forms of Gnosticism, such as Manichaeism, which taught that human beings are by nature flawed and are therefore not responsible for evil in themselves or the world. So if you go out and kill someone or rape someone, it's not your fault. It's really not your fault because we are flawed by nature. Now, to oppose that, early Christians said you are responsible for what you do, but then what happened? Augustine, while his early writings affirm that God's predestinating grace is granted on the basis of his... Anyway, it's all that we actually have to make a choice. God chooses us because we choose God, so there's a reciprocation. Augustine's later thoughts took a more deterministic direction because he was wrestling with some statements by Paul, and he began to say that no, you don't have any choice, and then all kinds of church leaders began to object to what Augustine was saying. They were saying, you sound like a Manichaean. As if, because we're flawed. Original sin, we're flawed. Therefore, we're not responsible for what we do. We can't enhance our chance of salvation. This is the whole, I don't want to go into the whole history of Christianity, but it was a big, big topic. Back in late antiquity, at the time of Augustine, again, at the time of the Reformation, it was a huge topic. People were literally killing each other over these things. And so you find the same thing playing out, not in such a violent way, in India. Ramanuja is one of the great teachers in the history of India. Vedanta teacher, we'll talk about him later. He's about about 1,000 years ago. But anyway, his followers split into two groups. The Vadakalais, who thought the individual soul has to surrender to God. You have to choose God. And the Tenkalais who said no. That, if you say that somehow what you did is helping your salvation, then you're taking away from God's glory. You're not being grateful to God. Give all the glory to God. Admit you did nothing. So what for me is kind of like this hyper piety. Like someone is so anxious to give all the credit to God that we have a situation where God discriminates. Like you have two souls who are equally qualified or unqualified, and God sends one to heaven for eternal bliss, and one goes to hell for eternal damnation, and they're the same. And what if your parents were like that? I mean, what if you and your sibling behaved exactly the same way, and your parents showered gifts on your sibling, and then, smacked you upside the head or something, or killed you, or, and you were actually behaving the same. Now, the response from within Christian theologians that believed in things like this, the response was that God has both justice and mercy. So when God saves the undeserving, that's mercy. And when he sends to hell the undeserving, that's justice, which didn't satisfy most people. Anyway, the only reason I'm mentioning this is because these issues that we're finding, for example, in Mimamsa, that Purushakara Daiva, to what extent do we have to please some God? To what extent is our own effort? How do we get salvation? These are issues that you find across the spectrum in Buddhism and in Muslim teachings and so on. People wrestling with these things. And I think the Mimamsas went to one extreme, saying that the gods, or if there is a God, has absolutely nothing to do with your going to heaven. Then you have another extreme saying that you have nothing to do with your going to heaven. It's just chosen for you, irrationally, by God, because he has the power to be irrational. And then you get things in the middle, where, and just to maybe to end this little discussion, in the Bhagavad Gita, the Bhagavad Gita is going to be basically the gold medal winner in Indian history. The Bhagavad Gita becomes the most popular, the most powerful, most influential book in Indian religious history. And in the Gita, I think you have this more reasonable approach saying that, imagine if you were raising children. Obviously you want to do everything you can for your children, but if you don't require them to make an effort, you're going to spoil them. It's not kindness on the part of the parent to spoil the child and say, you don't have to do anything, I'll do everything for you. And so requiring the child to reciprocate, requiring the child to do what's right, is a way of teaching good character and actually making the child strong. And so that's what the Gita teaches, that God reciprocates with souls, but at the same time, God reciprocates, but in a kind way. You can reciprocate with people kindly or unkindly, in a sense, and so there's this merciful reciprocation for our own benefit. We're required to also do the right thing, and if we don't do the right thing, we have to try again. No social promotions. We go back and try to do it again. So, but this is a debate which you see in India, which you see in Europe, over who is really responsible for our salvation. And I bring it up because Mimamsa, it's not something that anyone's ever heard of anymore for the most part, but some of the things they were wrestling with or talking about is something which has concerned people within the realm of religion forever, all over the world. And that's the point I wanted to make about that. Any questions on these things? If not, just a couple more minutes. Another, I think, universal issue, it's not just some technical, arcane Indian point, and that is, what's the status of language? Now, the Mimamsa people somewhat oddly said that there's no creator God, but the language is eternal. There's just eternal language. However, for the most part, attitudes toward language tended to fall into two schools. One was people that tended to say that our individual existence is an illusion. We are not really people. We are not really individual souls. That's an illusion. They also tended to say that language is an illusion, because language is something that people use. We speak, we hear, people use language. So if you are not really a person, language is not real. And therefore you get these statements like, the truth is beyond words, you can't express it with words. Ironically, the people that say that tend to write more books than anyone else. But anyway, you have that view. In that sense, the Mimamsa position is not so strange because they are realists and pluralists. These are words we'll use more later. realism means that you think right now you're in a room, right, in Florida. And the Mimamsa would say, you are in the room. No matter how much you become enlightened in the future, no matter how much your present take on this is not perfect or not enlightened, still, your basic sense that you are in a room right now and that you are a person and there's other people around you, that is basically true. So realism, our common sense take on the world, is basically true, if not completely. I mean, there's other things we can learn about the world. And the sense we have that there are individual objects, like this is a table, and that's a wall, and that you're a person, and that's another person. That's also true. Plurality. The idea that there are a lot of real things in the world. That's the Mimamsa position. So obviously they would say language is real. People like Nagarjuna, or just in general, philosophers who say that we're impersonalists, that personal existence is not ultimately real. Language also at a certain point is not real. On the other side, the Vedanta side, people that say that yes, you are a real person, and the reason you're a real person is because there's a real personal God, and that is a very powerful part of Indian religious history. There is a real personal God, an infinite personal God, and you're a person because you're part of that God, and because we are all ultimately personal. Language is real. Language is real because language is what people use, and we are really people, and God's a real person, and therefore language is real. So that's just a few words on language. Anyway, so we'll talk more about this Monday. Have a good weekend.